welcome to earreadthis, Edinburgh's most powerful book podcast. Today's interview was recorded in the public library of Edinburgh's seaside suburb Portobello, where I came to talk with author and Porty resident Alice Thompson. Our conversation touches on many of the ongoing concerns of this podcast, from the effect of Edinburgh's landscape on the mind of a writer, the conflict between artificial intelligence and creativity, which provides the subject of Alice's latest novel, Chimera, and the ways in which her work has been influenced by Sylvia Plath. Along with Chimera, Alice's other novels include The Existential Detective, The Book Collector, and Burnt Island, and she is also lecturer in creative writing at Edinburgh University. I was delighted to have the opportunity to talk with Alice, as I've been a fan of her novels ever since I first moved to Edinburgh. Now, bear in mind we were recording today in a public library, so you may pick up on the occasional whoop and roar of an enthused young reader. To start things off, I asked Alice how she feels about interviews like these and reflecting on her work.
It's really strange, not just because I wrote Chimera now, a year or so ago, but when I talk about my books, it does feel like I'm talking about a book that someone else has written. Mm-hmm. And I've thought about this, and I think it's because I write in such an intuitive, unconscious way that it's as if I'm not writing it. Mm. I know with the first draft, it's very intuitive, and then of course in second drafts and third drafts, I will bring my critical faculties to bear, but the heart of the book and the theme of the book definitely seems to come from a place where I'm not consciously aware of what I'm doing. So when I start talking about a novel, I can talk about it almost as if I'm someone else who's read the book and is discussing it.
As if you're a reviewer.
As if I was a reviewer.
Yeah.
So it can feel a bit odd sometimes, it's sort of cognitive dissonance.
When authors say things like, I couldn't pick between them, they're like my children. Do you? It feels like you don't feel that. You feel almost a bit more detached once the.
That is exactly right.
Yeah.
I do. Yes, I couldn't choose. I couldn't choose. I suppose I tend towards the last book I have written, simply because those are the themes and concerns that have been uppermost in my mind. I've been struggling with it for at least a year. So they are ideas that engage me and therefore seem more relevant, mm-hmm. and therefore uppermost in my mind. But the idea of actually choosing, they're books I think that I like less.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Not like children.
Yeah, not like children.
Because I was going to ask, because on the face of it, your books feel like they inhabit really radically different worlds in terms of genre and setting, even if there's a very distinctive tone shared between them. I was wondering where setting and genre comes for you. Is that a sort of part of the initial spark of a novel, or does that come later?
It's absolutely integral. I would say both those things, setting and genre, seem to come together for me in the initial spark for the book. Mm-hmm. So for Portobello, for The Existential Detective, Portobello was the spark, but it came together also with the idea of a detective and that sense of isolation, really, that comes from my detective. Chimera, the setting was outer space. The genre then became sci-fi. Mm-hmm. The two seem very indistinguishable for me, but also integral to what makes me want to write the book, or gives me the whole feeling and tone of the book.
I was going to ask about Portobello. There's a quote I really like by a writer who was based in Brighton, who said he liked being there because human phenomena got weirder the closer you got to the sea, and was talking about the colourfulness of Brighton. Do you find something similar for Portobello with its arcade and its history?
I was so bewitched by it and its history, mm-hmm. and the fact it was a thriving Victorian resort. It became slightly more lost money, became a bit more poor, and then it's sort of regenerating again. I mean, like all places, but I mean, there's a history in Britain, I think, of seaside towns being very successful in Victorian times, and then as people flew abroad more, mm-hmm. they didn't come to the towns so often. I think one of the things I do feel very much, coming back to this idea of setting and place, is especially if I'm writing about a place I know very well. For instance, I've lived in Portobello now for 20 years, is I needed a lot of time before I wrote it. So I've been living in Portobello for, 15 years or so, I can't quite remember, or 10 years when I wrote The Existential Detective. And I feel the place needs to sort of seep through me a bit. And if you write about a place too literally or describe it too specifically, it becomes a bit too like a travelogue. And I wanted to capture the feel of Portobello in The Existential Detective with its history and its interest, and as you say, it's colourful characters. So that's something that's quite important to me when I write about place and settings. I have to be in a place for a while. For instance, with The Falconer, which is set in the Highlands, again, it took me 10 years to really write about the Highlands of Scotland because I needed to feel the place in my bones.
I think when you read a novel that has a real setting but incorporates invented elements, the Existential Detective felt so evocative of Portobello, even when we were going into a location that you have made up. It feels, it's a bit like a Chandler novel. Not that I've ever been to LA. Yeah. But you can tell the geography is right, and then this setting is completely made up. And there's something, you're sort of talking to the myth of a place more than the OS map.
I think it really fascinates me. It comes up a lot in my writing, how you use place. And because my writing is quite surreal and imaginative, the springboard for that imagination and how you segue between reality or depiction of real place and my own imagination. And if you take, for instance, someone like Pharos, which is a lighthouse horror ghost story set on a lighthouse in Scotland, I wanted all the specifics about lighthouses and lighthouse building to be real, if you like, historically accurate. Yeah. But also superimposed upon that is my imagination. It's quite a difficult balancing act to get right.
Yeah, you sort of have to know enough to know what you can invent.
I don't know. It's almost like a nervous tick I have, that the bits that are factual have to be accurate.
Yeah.
Seems to be the opposite of what's going on in the world at the moment.
Yeah.
But, it's quite interesting, though, isn't that distinction between truth or fact and imagination? And imagination needs fact. It needs reality, of course. Dreams are based often on real events or real emotions. So it's just looking at that juncture.
Does that mean that it's a different process for you when you're writing somewhere that is grounded in a real location like The Existential Detective compared to a book like Chimera where you're doing all of there isn't a spaceship to start with?
It's funny you should say it, because my first response was, but it was a real spaceship,
yeah.
Which is nonsensical. But I suppose, I suppose when you say that, the spaceship to me seems quite real, simply because I'm drawing on common cultural images of spaceships in all the sci-fi films I've watched and the Philip K. Dick books I've read. So in that sense, the spaceship seems to me, if you like, as real as a 19th century lighthouse in Pharos. Where I start to take liberties are with the more surreal aspects, if you like, of the sci-fi, which are my own, and I try and be original, looking at consciousness or the shadows. They to me are the components of my imagination, and the spaceship imagery is what I'm drawing on from cultural appropriation.
Which ties into the theme of AI, the kind of the shared cultural data. The Chimera does. I read it thinking of that science fiction movie or that Philip K. Dick story.
Yes.
And to be wrapped up in a story of AI where we are sharing dreams or sharing cultural symbolism and iconography, that seemed to be the perfect sort of setting.
It was very much the theme of the book, was that idea of what is read, what are my influences, and what is the imagination, what is uniquely yours or subjective or human, and whether our individual consciousness is ever truly original.
Yes. AI is subject of a lot of writing at the moment, and you read anything about AI expecting a kind of critique of it, there's a lot of fearfulness about AI. But with Chimera, I felt that as much as there was a sort of fearfulness of AI, it seemed a bit of an indictment of our own imaginations a bit. There seemed to be as much human disappointment as tech fear, in that with AI we have our own. Well, we're totally responsible for what AI gives us. We're the input. If we get terrorized or bored or enslaved by AI, it's really, we've only got ourselves to blame.
I very much felt that. I think there's a line somewhere about in the book where I say we control technology. Mm-hmm. The end point is human. If AI takes control over us and the world, it's humans who are accountable. Exactly. We can't just say technology is evil, omnipotent, and has malice aforethought. We are the ones in control of it at the moment.
Exactly. It's not comparable to an alien invader or that sort of story. No, it is something we've built.
Exactly. It's a product of our imagination.
So it feels like one of the central faults is that we've started to idolize the thing that's just an idol, that's just something we've built.
One of my favourite lines in your review, which I was so glad you picked up on, was the idea that humans look like sex bots, which was in my book, and you said, isn't it supposed to be the other way around? Yeah. And that was exactly the point I was making, that we are imitating technology in many ways.
Exactly.
We are idealising it and humanising it and making it in our own image. And where does that lead us?
And there's this wonderfully sort of nasty dynamic of it being like a usurping younger relative, like the jealousness,
the Frankenstein motif, and yes, and this is playing out in real life, real time.
Yeah,
this possibility, and unfortunately, there are people in charge of it who don't seem accountable.
Having read Chimera and then reading backwards to books like The Existential Detective, it was interesting to see that there's AI there too, yes. and a similar theme of horror at the degradation or destruction of dreaming specifically. I mean, in Chimera, it's through dependence on virtual reality and sort of constant entertainment. But there's a line in The Existential Detective which is to do with drugs destroying dreams in a similar way. Is the sort of vitality of dreaming and imagination and storytelling a running theme?
Very much so, because I suppose I'm very interested in what makes us human, and what seems most integral to it is our ability to dream or imagine. That is part of our genius as humans, and the way technology is hijacking our dreams, substituting our dreams with technology's dreams, whether it's via the screen or virtual reality, and wondering about the consequences of that on us as individuals experiencing the real world, and how technology is almost mediating reality for us now, in a way that previously dreams helped us make sense of reality, and now it's computer chips.
We were sort of joking before recording about noise-cancelling headphones, but even as something as simple as that's world cancelling, that's attention cancelling. That's the same idea as the typical being hooked to a screen and
absolutely. And it does two things: it cancels, but also it replaces. So the point you're making about dreams, my attitude to dreams, it's replacing our dreams. It's not only eradicating them or making them irrelevant, it's actually giving us their ideas instead.
Yeah.
There's probably a template for what we like to dream about,
exactly,
which they are giving us.
A horrible sort of peer-reviewed composite idea of
focus grouped.
Yeah, exactly.
Dream scenario.
Yeah. I'm interested in how the loss of imagination, the loss of dreams, connects to a sense of losing cultural memory in your books. I loved the fact that in Chimera, as well as in The Existential Detective, people are walking around with names and tags connected to them that they seem unaware of. You depend on your reader knowing what they mean, but the characters often don't. I wondered if that was connected to a sense in your novels of characters trying to work out what story they're in. There's I think Violet in The Book Collector is sort of determined that if she works out what myth or fairy tale she's in, she'll be fine, she'll be all right. And likewise, the characters in Chimera feel like they're trying to puzzle out what they all signify, what their names signify.
Do you know what you've picked up on there? I think you've picked up on how I write, because often how I write is from a position of total ignorance about what's going to happen in my story.
Oh, really?
So I often think that what the characters are searching for a story, a plot, what's my role in the story, is actually me as a novelist trying to work out what the story is, which comes back to what I was saying earlier about my unconscious is leading me in a certain way, but my conscious has no idea. So I think that is played out in my characters' search for stories.
That's fascinating. Well, it translates to the reader's experience, I think.
Yes, it does.
I have a strong sense that you've buried a myth for your characters to find,
yes.
and they keep sort of tripping over little corners of it.
And I think what happens is, often once I've come to the end of a first draft, I will look at what my novel has told me about what it's about, and then bring out certain strands,
right,
or exaggerate, or pull out, for instance, the theme of Greek myth, and then work at that in following drafts. But it's interesting what you say about that my characters don't know the significance of their names, and I leave it up to the reader, and that is so true about what I expect from my readers. And of course that's quite a lot to ask, really. I'm asking the readers often in my books to fill in the gaps. I remember once, very early on in my career, I wrote a book. I won't go into the story of the publication story of it, but I remember my agent saying, "What's it about?" And I wrote a synopsis explaining it all. And she said, "Well, why can't you write like that?" And it's a sort of, I very much use imagery and symbols as a way of explaining things, and I'm not that fond of exposition.
No.
Again, it's very like a dream, really, where you're looking at the surface of things, but there's great depth behind the surface if you choose to understand it.
On the topic of imagery, I didn't realise until we were speaking earlier that you have a hand in choosing your artwork for your covers for your books, which are beautifully produced by Salt. What's the process like for choosing what kind of paint? Do you have a sort of some favourite painters that you draw from, or do you sort of seek something based on whichever work?
Gosh, I'm very lucky with my publisher, Salt. They've allowed me to choose all my covers. I'm pretty open-minded, actually. I was about to say I always go to the surrealists, but I don't. I do look at various painters to do with the themes of the book. I really look at what is my central theme. And with Chimera, the central theme was human consciousness versus machine consciousness. And I suppose that would have led me to the surrealists, because they were very, very taken with technology and machinery and the dehumanization. Even we're talking here about the 1920s, 1930s, a lot of the surrealists were looking at that mixture of industrial and body, human body, hybrids.
The violence of the clash between them,
but in a beautifully transparent way, if you like. The cover of Chimera really sums up the whole book. So it's a picture of two. The gender seems ambiguous, actually, but apparent women, with one woman with kind of mechanical balls and rods instead of a brain. And I remember being slightly worried, saying to my publisher, "Won't this put people off buying it?" But
I think it'll make people want to pick it up.
It's certainly intriguing.
Definitely, yeah. I think it also it perfectly sums up the mixture of classical notes and the science fiction element of Chimera.
Yes,
because you've got that sort of mechanical look alongside something that could be a ruined statue, or
And it comes back to also that idea of using classical names for my characters, and the idea of this being a preoccupation of what is human consciousness that has been prevalent since classical civilization. It's not a new question.
No.
So whether it was ancient Greece or the Surrealists of the 1920s, these are still themes that are relevant to being human.
Definitely.
It is a particularly contemporary issue, but it's not new.
No. What I really loved about the names in Chimera that felt really contemporary, despite the fact that we're on a futuristic spaceship, was unlike, say, the existential detective, where you have a main character called William Blake, and ideas of Blake's poetry dominate the case. In Chimera, there's this sort of clash of classical but then more recent figures as well, taking up the names of the crew, and that felt really quite a lot like the modern world, where you see classical signifiers, but you have the sense that they're being used in a way in which the significance has been forgotten. Hermes used as a delivery. Does everybody know why that's called Hermes? Or what you can think of countless examples of that. But the idea you get with AI is it draws indiscriminately from this pool of data we have.
It cannibalizes,
and it doesn't necessarily know how they all fit together.
No, it's peculiarly contemporary, but also I think in a way we're privileged to have this access to history, philosophy, literature. From where we're standing now, we can draw on our past.
Yeah.
And I find that liberating, really, that there are these references I can make and not really be constrained by time.
Does Edinburgh factor in at all in that? That's when that side of your writing, because I was particularly with Chimera, but also with the existential detective, which is of course set in Edinburgh's environs, and in Edinburgh itself we go to the portrait gallery and things like that. But this sort of people carrying around bits and pieces of classical myth seems to fit very well with Edinburgh, with its classical pretensions.
Absolutely, the Athens of the North.
Athens of the North. It's appropriating classical architecture without necessarily knowing how it all fits together.
It's gosh, yes. I mean, I don't like to use the word use, but I suppose that's what Edinburgh's doing, and perhaps what I'm doing, or the architecture of Edinburgh's doing. It's paying homage as well.
Yeah.
And perhaps by just picking out a Corinthian column or a classical name for one of my heroines, in a way what I'm trying to do, and what perhaps the architectures of Edinburgh are trying to do, is open the door to a whole world by just using that single reference. It's almost like shorthand for a whole world. The
way that a pillar suggests a door without quite making one. Yeah. I was thinking about this the other day and going, you can see this sort of cultural forgetting happening in real time, even with modern iconography. So the shop that I work on is middle of Harry Potter land, and there are sort of local rumours being invented about those books in real time. Nonsense, total nonsense. That's this isn't the basis of something in the Harry Potter books, but it's useful to pretend it is. And it feels like there's something about Edinburgh that just attracts this sort of like, we'll just make things up, and
it's so coming back to this discussion of what's true and what's not nowadays, and it's never been more prevalent. And with the internet and disinformation, AI, fake imagery, and how the internet is allowing these rumours to become part of our common parlance and become real simply because enough people are exchanging disinformation between each other. It's such a powerful force in its own right, this appropriation of certain ideas.
I wanted to just quickly talk about Sylvia Plath a little bit, because I mentioned her in the review of Chimera. She's not the only poet or writer referenced in Chimera, but she feels like a significant one, since you draw on a poem on the plethora of dryads, and dryads are a huge feature of Chimera. Could you tell us a little bit about how that poem came to be involved in that book? It
comes back to this idea of my first draft not really knowing what I'm doing. It's so intuitive. I love Sylvia Plath. I'm trying to think actually how it came about.
Did the dryads come first, or did the poem?
I think the dryads came first, actually. I think that came from my knowledge of Greek myth, and I wanted the androids. I wanted to sort of slightly move away from the androids as being particularly mechanical. Look at how technology can become more feminine, if you like.
Yeah.
More amorphous, more diaphanous. So I think that's where the Dryads came from, and whether that triggered a memory, probably did, because I love Sylvia Plath and I've read a lot of her work. So I brought her in as an example of possible AI poetry.
It works so fantastically well. I mean, you would have thought, I could have imagined that the poem, the Dryad's plot of the Chimera sprung from the poem.
Yeah,
it almost feels like the poem is custom built for the novel.
But do you know what I did there? There was something I did do, which was a direct result of the poem, which she mentions. You'll probably be able to quote it more directly. Is it the red, green, blue?
Red, green, and blue is the last line.
And I changed the colour of my, I think it was the lights of the computer or the lights of Earth. I can't remember. Very early on, the first few pages of the book, I changed the use of colours. I referenced those colours into my book. So that was a case of her directly influencing the writing. But it's quite interesting what you say about it working as an AI poem, because I don't know if you saw, Ash, they did an experiment quite recently showing AI writing and showing, I think it was T.S. Eliot.
Yeah.
And people preferred the AI writing because actually it was less complex.
Yeah.
It was more conversational and less imagistic.
In a way, like the poetry that Eliot was doing was a sort of fake AI. Taking different, like a poem like The Wasteland, taking these little shards of things and reassembling them is sort of human AI compositing.
But it's interesting that people, I can't remember if they thought it was AI or they preferred it.
Yeah.
But they definitely preferred the writing that seemed more basic and obvious.
Yeah. I could definitely, I mean, it made total sense that someone encountering Plath at that point would think, clearly a Dryad wrote this.
Yes.
Clearly an AI wrote
yes.
this. Yeah. In the setting of cultural loss of memory and also lack of confidence. That's what the thing I really liked about Chimera is the lack of human confidence, a baleful lack of sort of species confidence, I suppose.
Yes, absolutely. An erosion, really, of our confidence, which has really happened over the past, I think, 2 decades or one decade. And and this worship, really, of technology.
Of technology, yeah.
I mean, I was hearing someone talk on the radio today about AI, and it's like they were so excited about it. It was like I felt it's talking about a new toy. A boy would talk about a new toy that they'd found.
There was something in the TLS the other day about a teacher who just can't wait for this new AI teaching assistant to come in. And
talk about turkeys voting for Christmas.
Exactly, yeah.
I know.
I understand that there are arguments for it, but I can't get over the dystopian failure of it all.
One of the things that makes me laugh, again, it's a total lack of imagination, really, is people make jokes about how it's useless and it makes all these mistakes, and as if somehow that's reassuring, and as if to say, well, but what's going to happen in 5 years' time? Is it going to be so stupid?
Yeah.
Is it still going to want to be your assistant in 5 years' time?
Or are its mistakes simply going to expand in scale and become more and more catastrophic?
Yes.
Not a spelling error, but
a global error.
A global. Oh, whoops! Yeah, accidentally deleted Europe.
Earth.
Yeah, yeah. Just to finish up on Plath, is she someone you've thought about with connections to other novels? Because having read Chimera and then reading back, there's a few notes of Plath I picked up on that could be.
Are you thinking of The Book Collector?
I'm thinking of The Book Collector. Yes, I'm thinking of the. You've got a wonderful line about ECT in there with "kissed by fire twice." Do
you know what I probably was?
Yeah.
I'm very interested in themes of mental illness, actually, and how it can fracture reality for many people, and also the connection between imagination and mental illness and extreme subjectivity, where the world seems to collapse in on itself. And Sylvia Plath writes so beautifully about it. I've read all her diaries as well, actually, I mean, in the book collector, it's particularly, you know, it's postnatal psychosis, which obviously just happens to women who give birth. And I could well have been very influenced by that because I was very aware of Sylvia Plath and what she went through and the history of her suicide attempts and her ECT experience.
There's a tonal similarity, which you know, Plath's worlds are often full of you know, classical ruins, like we've talked about, but fairy tale as well. But one thing I really like about your novels is sometimes in modern either fairy tale retellings or novels that evoke myth, they're quite sparse. They seem to sort of depend on myth in a way where they keep it quite vague and open, whereas your worlds seem that they're very peculiar and precise and the detail specific, and that's something I really like about Plath as well. Is, you know, you encounter those classical ruins quite close up and in high definition, not as a sort of general theme being evoked.
And that's interesting because I read Greek and Latin at school, and I feel in a way myth is in my bones a bit. Yeah. It's not something I've just come to late on in life and thought, oh, that's interesting, and I'll pick that out. Yeah. It is so perhaps you've observed that myth to me has a lot of significance, and I have a lot of respect for it. So perhaps that's what you're picking up on. Yeah, in my writing.
I think so. I think there's a strong sense of familiarity there.
Yes. And emotional familiarity. You know, something you come across when you're young. Yes. I think has an influence on you in a different way to something when you're older.
Yeah. Speaking of myth, could we perhaps finish by talking a little bit about what's coming up for you and your newest novel?
Well, fun enough, that's when I've been talking to you, Ash. I've been vaguely getting sort of flashbacks to my present book because it's set in ancient Greece, and I'm very interested in the Delphic oracle and that idea of prophecy. But I suppose I'm looking at the contrast between also philosophy and form and reality, which of course was a preoccupation of Plato, and it's very much set at the time of Plato. It's also looking at political power. It's quite interesting because you'd think setting it in this world would immediately make it very mythical, but actually the opposite seems to have happened. And at the moment there doesn't seem to be much myth, which is slightly strange. And I think probably if one thought about it, easily explicable, but I can't quite work out the logic of it.
It's like the Simpsons joke, Brazil nuts, or as we call them in Brazil, nuts. If you're in the world of myth, maybe it doesn't seem so mythic.
I think that's it. I think that's such a good joke. Yes, perhaps that's what it is.
It's a sort of when in Rome, I suppose.
Yes, and it's all around them.
Yeah. That's really interesting, though, because your books, as we've been talking about, are so full of myth. Like to go there, perhaps it's changing the order of.
Well, it's almost I think I'm just talking off the top of my head here, but the idea of my whole book being a kind of myth, the whole story being a myth. But I don't know if that's true or not to say that. That is what I'm working on at the moment.
Brilliant. Well, I can't wait to read it.
Oh, thank you, Ash.
Alice, thank you so much for doing this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ash. It's been a pleasure.